Hello, welcome to Station 4, Cultural Border Studies with a focus on cultural studies. Klaus here talking to you. Can you hear and see me? All right. Who of you is enrolled at Nikolaev at Black Sea National University? Just a quick check. Okay. Border Studies program people? Raise your hand. Okay, so we are a mixed group and a lot of the next 20-25 minutes will have to do with identity and difference. That's why this first quick check, we don't have the time to do really a round of introductions right now, but it's going to be instead over to our presentation that I'm going to make visible here. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint? Is that working?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Cultural studies in a very quick overview. What is it all about? Some of the key concepts. What is it all good for? Some of the objectives rolled into a short presentation and very briefly touching upon methods. I was imagining, since we saw a map this morning, I was imagining a journey through Europe between the Saarland or Saarbrücken and Nikolaev, or vice versa, with maybe a stop in between in Vienna. And if I did this journey, which I've never done to Ukraine, unfortunately, I've only traveled to the Saarland, I would cross all of these boundaries that you can see here, all of these national borders that you can see on the map, but I would also encounter all of these different cultures and identities and differences, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. Which questions would I have in mind as a traveler, and which questions would I have in mind as a cultural studies person interested in learning something about culture along the way? From your course description that we've put together, a few key questions for your projects in this course. How do people live the border? How important is the border to them? What does the border mean to them? What stories do they tell? What conflicts do they experience? Which linguistic or cultural practices do they engage in? Could be questions that I would have on my mind as I travel. And all of these have cultural studies already in them. I've made this visible using 4 different colors for 4 different key concepts in cultural studies. Namely, the blue, people. Who are the people that experience all of this, that live there? That refers to identity, which is a key term and concept, and I'm going to explain in a minute. How do they live the cultures that I travel through? How do they live the border and their experiences? Refers to culture and living culture and experiencing culture. The importance of all of that to them, of the border, and what does it mean to them? What stories do they tell about it and about their lives at or across or near or at a distance to the borders that we're talking about? Refers to representation. And in all of this, there are certain conflicts that I might discover. Borders on, at, around, across borders. And with conflicts, that refers us to the 4th key term, and that is power. And all of this put together is often represented as the so-called cultural studies triangle, which looks a little bit like a pyramid here, but it's supposed to be a triangle, which you, in a more neat kind of way, would find represented in cultural studies literature, maybe like so. As we study culture, as we travel literally or metaphorically through these different cultural spaces across Europe on this map that I showed you, we'll be engaging in the questions that have to do with identity, representation, and power, and they're all related to each other, which is represented by this triangle. Each of them impacts the other one, and this is sort of our playing field. Now, as I travel, I could be interested either just more like in what's often called high culture, like the arts, like painting and classical music. But I think I would not only go to museums and visit big cities and exhibitions and things like that, but I think I would be very much interested in the everyday culture. Like how do you live? How do you study? What does that look like at university? How do people get together and socialize and eat and share good times with each other? How do they live in a city? What are their daily routines as they live in a city or in the country? What kind of everyday popular culture do they consume? You know, television, music, popular art. Meaning cultural studies looks at culture with a wide scope, or with the idea that it looks at culture, what's often called sort of an anthropological view, meaning a broad or wide view of culture, in the sense of culture is ordinary, it's like everyday. I've just put in one name here, Raymond Williams, often referred to or regarded as the founding father of cultural studies, who said, that's where we must start. Culture is ordinary, it's the everyday life. So if I was to travel and analyze a bit at the same time, then I would start to analyze the world that surrounds me as I travel and the social experiences that shape identities of the various groups that I encounter, also those that I belong to or I associate with, and I would try to discover the beliefs and practices and the relations between beliefs and practices and other beliefs and practices and assumptions at a given point in time as I do that. The important thing in cultural studies that needs to be added is, we had the word conflict before, that culture in this ordinary everyday sense is not seen as like a nice, rounded, harmonious whole where everything works out splendidly well for everybody and everybody's happy, but it is seen as conflictual or conflicted and divided also and struggled over. And what I tried to make visible here with these not very fancy graphics, I'm afraid, with these squiggly lines and arrows, is these divisions in culture that cultural studies looks for and tries to detect and analyze. And there could be divisions between gender or between social and income groups or between ethnic groups, all sorts of cultural differences that are often of a conflicted and conflictual nature. So culture is seen as also to some extent divided and divisive or struggled over, and not just a nice, round, harmonious whole, like I said. You've heard of ideas or concepts like cultural centers versus margins, like being in Austria, here in Vienna or close to Vienna today. Vienna is in many ways the Austrian cultural center, and the rest of Austria is kind of marginal in its cultural importance, as it is, at least as it is seen very often. Or high culture versus people's ordinary everyday culture, or legitimate versus illegitimate culture, often has to do with elites versus marginalized groups in a culture, with dominant versus marginalized cultures, even oppressed cultures in a given country or culture. And that's important to see and make visible and ask critical questions about. And I think in your projects, when you do these storytelling projects, and you're probably first gonna listen to people and interview, then what we would like you to do is have one ear open, or have both ears open maybe, towards these fault lines or divisions in culture, where things are, conflicts seem to exist and become visible when you take a closer look. The central one probably being borders, of course, for this project, for your course in this project. Borders that divide cultures or are conflictual. These could be national borders, is probably the first thing on our mind that comes to our mind, as represented in maps like these that have all these national borders worldwide, and they represent cultures from a national culture point of view. Like you see Canada and you see Russia and you see the map of Germany, and with their sort of the national identity being in the foreground. Whereas we had in this blank map of Europe this morning, where also the national borders give us a sense of where we are and what the cultural divisions seem to be. But this is, from a cultural studies point of view, and historically speaking, of course, also this is not always the single one or most important determining cultural division. But I'll give a historical example from my biography, because in your projects, biographies and stories about people's lives are going to be important. Have you heard of the Iron Curtain, the idea or the concept of the political term or popular term for the political situation up to 1990, 1991, the Iron Curtain that divided the west of Europe from the east of Europe? I suppose that's something that you've come across and heard about. Western Europe, capitalist, liberal democracies versus Eastern Europe, Eastern European countries, communist and non-democratic or authoritarian systems of government. And when I grew up in the late 1970s and as a teenager in the mid and late 1980s, this was like the one major cultural, if you will, division in Europe that we grew up with. I grew up here in Austria, that's that gray bit in the middle, and very much in the eastern part, so it was only about 120, 140 kilometers from the eastern border to Hungary, from the Iron Curtain, the so-called one, which meant that our cultural perception of identity was that this is where the free world ends, and this is where we are in the West with democracy and with a consumer and market society and so on and so forth. And we didn't travel very far into Eastern countries. The newest reports we got from the East, or from the Eastern Bloc countries, as they were called, they were often, I think in hindsight, they were often very one-sided or also probably stereotypical. And there was very little cultural diversity that we saw. Like if I traveled through all of these countries, I think I would see so much cultural difference and so much cultural diversity on so many levels, which was in the dominant perception at the time was very much leveled out or ironed out even, and made invisible, basically. It was all East versus West that kind of dominated our perception of who we are as Austrians or as Europeans at the time. And that's changed, of course. The national boundaries and borders have become less important to some extent and have become again more important to some extent, as you know, within the European Union, within the Schengen countries, for example. We've been able to travel without having to stop at borders for a number of years. But then it became all of a sudden became important again with the corona pandemic, when national borders were patrolled again and became more important, for example, for the everyday traveler again. So these are all historical circumstances that will change and shift, and the notion of which boundaries, culturally speaking, or which borders, which national borders and other borders are important, changes depending on the historical context. And that's important to observe and to ask also, if that's the case, what other differences could be important, not just national ones, political ones, like I mentioned with the Iron Curtain, or other differences altogether. Like if we zoomed in into any of the countries, if we zoomed in into Austria, we would see different ethnic groups that have specific political status in Austria, for example, as I'm sure in all countries. There are different differences within these national boundaries and borders. And what cultural studies makes us want to do is to kind of sharpen our questioning capabilities, so to speak, or to ask sharper more detailed questions, more critical questions, perhaps. So if I traveled as a sort of naive traveler first, I would maybe go along my route here through these different countries, and I would travel to, first from Germany, I would say, what is German culture like? What are you like as a German? Yeah, or what are Czech people like? Yeah. And that's a pretty naive question in a way, and I want to make it more complex and complicated by asking, for example, not what is it like, but in which case do you identify as German, or what does it mean when you identify with culture, let's call it X? What other differences are at play? Yeah, are there other differences that are equally important maybe, and that are just not so visible at the moment? And not just national cultural difference, for example, belonging to one of these ethnic groups in Austria that I mentioned that might identify as Austrian citizenship, but culturally and language-wise also having a second culture that is equally as important to them. What are the effects of this identification? So we can shift the questions a bit from like, what is it like, or is this an authentic example or a representative of culture X, of Austrian culture, or is this a stereotype, for example? And with that, we are already in the territory of culture and identity. And identity is constructed through, I've been hinting at that a bit already, through several, it's called social differences. And what you can do after class is maybe have a look at this PowerPoint, which has these movable identity categories. And the question is, how would you arrange these differences, yeah, identity categories or categories of difference, gender, sex, age, and so on, in a given cultural context in terms of your own identity? For example, yeah, they're not going to be all equally important like that, like never, I think. But for example, in our situation in the classroom right now, which social difference would be important for us, for me, if I think about how would I arrange that? I would think that my gender right now is not so important. Maybe my nationality culture, maybe only insofar as the language that I'm able to use. I couldn't speak Ukrainian with you mostly because of my national background, being Austrian. But I think what would be very important is, and can make it big and move it to the foreground, move it in front of nationality even here, important, yeah, all the way to the foreground. Occupation, because right now in this context, as we're zooming, I'm the teacher by occupation in my social role, and that difference becomes more important as we are speaking here. And as I gave you my story about the 1980s and the Iron Curtain and so on, age would also be important to some extent, I think. So what happens after class, 4:30, as I'm gonna go shopping maybe and get some dinner prepared for later with my folks, maybe this all moves to the background again, and maybe family status becomes important and moves to the foreground, and definitely forward of nationality and all of these things. And you can move this around as you like and as makes sense for you in a given cultural context. Or actually, strictly speaking, the context does a lot of the moving around for us. Like we get to decide, maybe to a certain extent, which of these differences will be important at any point. But again, going back to our imaginary journey between Saarbrücken and Nikolaev, as soon as I enter Germany, or as soon as I enter the Czech Republic, my nationality might come to the foreground, because I'm perceived as, here's a foreigner, where is he from? He's an Austrian. And I have to show my passport at the border check, of course, and see, Austrian, European Union, okay. But I go back to Austria and maybe all of a sudden my culture or my occupation or my social class background or social difference, as you want to call it, moves to the foreground. You get a bit of the idea what this, how this works, and can you play it through yourself if you find some time? It's a self-reflection kind of activity. Keywords in cultural studies. Again, I'm not sure whether you've encountered these in other studies that you've done in other disciplines where they're also used. Identity is historical. That means it is constructed or performed also. It does not have an essence. It is often called non or anti-essentialist. I'm not an Austrian once and for all. It does not define or determine who I am outside of a context, like once and for all or wherever I find myself. Yeah, but it's constructed through these movable, like I try to illustrate, movable depending on context differences that I've listed here again. And so as you think about who you're interviewing, or as you think about people's biography, of course, a starting question that we're interested in is, who are you? Who am I? But moving this to the next level again, like moving it up into a cultural studies level, how am I positioned by a cultural context in a given moment? Like, for example, when I travel, like I gave this example, I travel across the border. At the border checkpoint, that checkpoint positions me as Austrian by citizenship, therefore European Union member, therefore certain rights at the border check, for example. And how can I negotiate this positioning? How do I position myself? Do I have a little bit of maneuvering space to negotiate? That's a typical cultural studies term, that these differences are given somehow, but they're not entirely fixed, and I can interpret them or negotiate them to some extent. Like my social difference / identity role as a teacher at this moment, I can negotiate that to a certain extent. And what does that do to me? And what does it do to you as students, depending on how I negotiate the teacher role? Okay, so far? The main terms, the main work done. Two more concepts, though, really important. Representation, which means that all of the things that we've been doing so far, they're mediated through some level of what's called representation. That is through language in some way, storytelling, people talking to each other, or also language in the sense of visual language, photographs, images, videos, written stories in newspapers, on blogs, in the news media, in the evening news, etc. There's always this level of mediation through language going on. And this works in a way that the reasonable questions to ask from a cultural studies point of view would mean, like, what does this level of mediation do to whatever topic we're looking at, in this case, to the border question. And the question would not be so much, is this represented correctly or accurately or realistically, as you would expect from, for example, from the news or from a documentary, where it should be pretty obvious that you get accurate information and not a good and not a bad representation. But shifting the question and say, what does that mean? Like, how does this representation work? What are the strategies? When somebody tells you a story, the strategy could be subjective first-person storytelling, subjective narration. What does it mean if somebody gives you a subjective first-person account? It could also be like, what are the effects of that? Like, who profits and who doesn't, and in which ways? What are the benefits for whom? How is this representation used? Like, why do we get certain news images and not others? What is selected? What is left out? What is presented in which order? You know a little bit about storytelling, I suppose, and film analysis and critical analysis of visual narratives and so on. And that's exactly that level of how is it told and what are the effects of that, right? That could go for your interviews as well that you do, but also for your final product that you put together. To keep that level in mind. How does representation work in these? And then finally, there's the question of power, and that's what, from a cultural studies point of view, makes it all important and makes it all interesting. Like, why are we asking these questions in the first place? Because we're interested in how does this affect all of us in terms of we are positioned in a given culture or cultures within these fault lines and dividing lines, and what's the effect of that. And the concept of power that we're using is very much like a network, like in this picture. Like, I'm a tiny, in this moment, I'm this node in the network, meaning power comes this way and goes out that way and also that way. It's not top down. Yeah? As a teacher right now, I don't have like absolute power and I don't exert it top down on you, but it's more like the context puts us into these positions. And from there, certain movements of power result. And that's often called being empowered and being disempowered at the same time in some ways. Like, for example, right now as a teacher, I'm empowered in certain ways because I can tell you what I think is important, but I'm also maybe disempowered because there are certain expectations that you have and the university has in this context of what I'm supposed to do and what I'm not supposed to do. So it's not like a top-down thing, but it results from this complex interaction of identity and difference and cultural practices. And back to our journey for the last minute or so, back to our journey. What does that mean? That means as we cross different boundaries and borders, differences become more complex. The closer we look, we should look for not just the obvious or seemingly obvious ones like national ones, but when you think of our group here, for example, age and generation could be a difference between me and you might be actually very much joined or unified by sharing a certain generation with certain tastes in culture and certain hobbies and certain interests and internet culture and social media and pop culture. And if you got together outside of class, that would maybe override your national differences and even your language differences very much, because you would feel like you're part of the same generation. I could imagine. I'm just sort of speculating my hypothesis that I would then ask you about and test. Like, right now, do you feel your identity is primarily in this classroom or in this group? Is it still, or even was it ever primarily dominated by nationality, or by which of these aspects? Or is it occupation, or, like I said, is it age/generation? If you get together after class, if you could share drinks and chat about your hobbies, Netflix and whatnot, that this is actually the difference that is much more important in your identity. And which other ones could we discover as we travel here that are as important in some contexts, maybe even more important in some contexts, or override or are at play when it comes to ethnic identity or to gender identity, that works across national borders and makes national identity much more complex. And we would have to start drawing the map by getting rid of these national labels and filling in maybe circles and arrows from Nikolaev to Saarbrücken, how we are united by the identity factor education at this moment, for example. Okay, so final word for your projects. I've put up this little box here. We're running out of time again. Apologies. Any questions at the end? have you got a bit of an idea of the cultural studies triangle and how to get into the issue from any of these points of view and ask interesting critical questions of it?
I got a question. Is
Yes.
the question, where do I belong? Is it the same or similar to what you presented with the differences? Like, where do I belong to which category, or because for me it is mostly, I ask myself more, I belong to this, you call them like, or maybe category or differences. So I belong to the master border studies group. This is like the most important part for me right now, that I belong to this group. I know better, basically.
So that I would explain that so that this difference moves to the foreground in this context right now. But maybe after class you go home and this where do I belong takes on, there's a different set of differences moving to the foreground. Is it family, or is it your cultural peer group that you feel you belong to? Is it male friends? Does it have to do with gender? And this could always vary depending on the context, and then there's what you make of it, how you negotiate that in cultural studies terms, which can sound a bit technical, but give us kind of an entry into just a question: where do people feel that they belong, and how is that belongingness constructed of a certain set of differences? Yeah, running out of time. Sorry. See you soon, I hope.
Знов цікава розмова почалася і закінчився час.
Okay, people are coming back again. Wow. We need stamina today. Can you still breathe? Are you still okay?
Yes.
Okay, I think now it's time to close your eyes and meditate for a couple of minutes.
Warmed up by now.
One more to go.
Question: is this my recording that is still going on? Because I think I wasn't able to stop that at the end.
I think it's automatically stopped when we close the room.
I can't understand what's going on at all. So something
is recording though.
I was recording my session, but
yeah.
You need to stop recording. Yeah.
Should I click the stop button here?
Yes, and then
That's me.